Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base Biotech podcast, and this is number 42, apparently the answer to the universe, and it's also going out on January the 16th. My voice is slightly improving after the flu and tonsillitis. I was on the other side of the microphone earlier this week as I did 3 interviews about my latest book with National Radio in Canada. And I was petrified that I was going to have a coughing fit live on the air. One of my friends messaged me after the interview and said how my voice sounded great because it was so deep and gravelly. I kind of prefer it when I can talk. Anyway, it's another marathon episode, so less of me, more of the guests. And for that reason, we also won't do the weekly roundup of the latest news that you may have missed over at deeptechdigest.com. You'll just have to check it out. But I think that period of very little news is already over. Last week we talked about eye treatments with Oculus, mitochondria with Vandria, and we had a conversation about GoCo Health Innovation City in Gothenburg, Sweden. This week we're talking about treating blood cancers with Nisit Khandelwal, co-founder and CEO of Cycuria Therapeutics, Ulrik Zeuthen, CEO, and Katarina Cantell, founder and CSO of Adalyon, and Craig Ritchie, founder and CEO of Scottish Brain Sciences, with Deborah O'Neill, CEO and CSO of NovaBiotics, as well as chair of the Life Sciences Board of Opportunity Northeast. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other comments, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com, which is also the address you can use if you're interested in advertising with us or sponsoring a podcast episode or for event coverage. Okay, let's get to the first of those interviews. First this week we have 2 people from Adalyon, a company that has coined the phrase "Is speech the new blood?" To find out what that means, and more about the use of speech as biomarkers and in diagnosis, are Adalyon founder and CSO Katarina Cantell and the company's CEO Ulrik Zeuthen.
All right, so maybe a little bit of background so everybody will understand also why this company came to be. So I originally started my career in the heart rate monitoring technology field, which essentially was a consumer technology back then, serving sports professionals and athletes. And today, heart rate as data source is actually used very widely in clinical research and clinical practice as a health indicator. So this is kind of my backtrace to digital biomarkers. I've done majority of my career in information systems field, but the sort of origins, my academic background lies in behavioral sciences. So I'm a kind of a tricky hybrid combining the soft human sciences with the hard technology. And the past 4 years before I founded Adalyon, I worked at Ava Medical, which is a private healthcare operator in Finland, very deep in the healthcare domain, serving use cases where I realized that a lot of the information and data about people's well-being, patient lives are collected with questionnaires and surveys. And this led to the frustration that could we actually have better data sources for us to understand the human? And I came to the question that what if we could measure the mind like we measure the heart or we measure the blood? This is sort of the moment, the pivotal moment. I remember it was in October 2021 when I also knew that now the NLP technologies and speech technologies, this was just before ChatGPT hit off, I knew that the technology was ripe enough to actually be applied to build services on top of. So because I have been deep in the technology space, so I counted 1 + 1, and I figured that now or never, somebody's got to do something about it. And I founded Adalyon with the idea of actually leveraging speech data to provide objective insights. Obviously, today for healthcare professionals and clinicians, but originally we actually started to serve organizations and leaders to better understand team dynamics and what's happening with the employees and people in companies. So why did we go into the leadership space? Because COVID hit right then, and people moved so there was a pain that we needed to address first, and we built a psychological safety model.
Time for Ulrik to get involved, and I wonder if you could tell me a bit about your background and what drove your interest in joining the company.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So my background is as a economist. So I've always been very fascinated with modeling things, and throughout my career, I've worked in data and AI for the last 6 years. I've been in the pharmaceutical domain, but I've been across industries. And most recently, I worked as a director of data and AI in NovaBiotics, where I worked to scale AI across the company. So not just bring in AI or try it out or PLC it, but actually scale it, get that return on investment, make sure that you get some real impact. And I think this is often the issue, right? That it's a lot of talk, but we're missing sometimes the real impact, which is a little bit curious, because there's no doubt when you compare the pharma AI possibilities to other sectors like fintech and so on, there's just so immense possibility in the pharmaceutical world, but it is difficult because it's heavily regulated. What I saw in Adalyon is actually a quite rare combination that I don't think you see a lot. One thing is you see this quite advanced technology with agentic AI and large language models. And then secondly, you see clinical use cases. So not research or packaging, but clinical trials applying AI in that domain. That is pretty much as regulated as it comes, right? So you have to have a lot of explainability and full control. And then just to top it all off, we're not talking about analyzing data in the back room after the fact. We're talking about live inference with actual patients. So that sort of trifecta of domains is quite rare. And as I learned about sort of the strong foundation that's been built up in Adalyon, I saw that this use case and these signals we get from speech biomarkers can make a quite significant impact directly on patient lives suffering with severe chronic disease, and at the same time sort of utilizing this technologies which is moving quite fast, right? So I think it's very rare to see sort of a strong, impactful use case in this domain.
And so could you maybe explain a little bit about the technology and what the speech biomarker platform is and how it works?
Sure, I can go first, and maybe you can supplement me, Katla, afterwards. The technology at first is, I think it's very important to say that it's built on this strong foundation in behavioral science. So understanding actually humans. Understanding what classifies people as having anxiety or depression, what motivates them in different directions. That part I'll let Katja talk maybe more into. But other than that, what it is we have a platform that allows us to pick up live speech. You don't have to sit afterwards and do analysis. You can actually act upon it straight away. And we do it through semi-guided journaling, where the patient or the participant sits on our platform and just does journaling maybe once, twice a week. And the semi-guided ensures that we're covering the most relevant areas and stays in domains that are very interesting. And then you can say live, what we do is we annotate all that information, which is both what they say, the semantics of it, but also everything they don't say, so the pauses and the pitch and the speech rate and so on. We annotate that into our own IP, built up library of signals that we can then use to map into these larger behavioral biomarkers. So for instance, anxiety is made up of a lot of underlying signals in any conversation. It doesn't even have to be a conversation around anxiety. And the uses for this is quite wide. You can use it to, for instance, to detect cognitive decline in a person. You can hear on their speech motor function if it's deteriorating earlier than traditional biomarkers. But you can also use it to listen to what type of person do I have in front of me here. Is this a person where this is a good fit to a given study? Is this study going to work for them, or are they going to drop out halfway because it's actually not the best of fits? I think this is a major issue in pharma, the massive dropout rate, where you find often after the fact, during phase 2 maybe, that a lot of participants drop out because there wasn't just a sufficient fit between the participant and the study.
I'd maybe like to complement when Ulrik and I are sort of discussing the essence of Adalyon. We like to think that we're actually not a tech company. We're not a technology company, but we're an IP company, since our solutions and our products are very strongly based on a deep understanding of behavioral patterns, behavioral models that people exhibit in daily lives, in their speech and communication, and understanding what those behaviors actually mean in terms of predicting trial adherence, in terms of predicting state changes throughout chronic diseases, for example. One very interesting capability is to measure the level of fatigue just by analyzing daily speech journaling data. Other use cases, our Chief Technology Officer, Rico Nyberg, just published his first piece of research on how LLM-based technologies can be used to actually predict PHQ-9 and GAD-7 scores from transcripts that are not actually psychological interviews by psychiatrists, but general discussions about work and work life. And I think this is the interesting thing, that we can detect these signals from organic speech, but we really need to be careful about how to gather that data, how to leverage that data. And since you asked about the product and the technology, it's basically two parts. So one part is, how do we intake speech as data? So we have an API-based architecture where we can take speech in from different modalities. We already did it in our previous phase. We took in speech from on-device solutions, from iPhones, iOS, in very sort of confined situations like board meetings where we can't even use any cloud-based solutions. We took speech in from Teams meetings. We could analyze our conversation here if we wanted to. But today we can take speech in from many different media, be it an already existing patient app. But we have built also our own sort of protocol where the simplest way is to do, for example, daily or weekly voice journaling. And we can build that protocol into any device that the patients are using in a trial. The second part is actually flowing that speech through our own proprietary pipeline and organizing the data in a way that we can actually run it through specific models, studying specific phenomena, for example, fatigue, anxiety, personality traits, which are actually very critical in predicting trial adherence, and other use cases. And I think this ability to run this data systematically through these models forms up our core IP and also the ability to produce repeatable insights. So we do leverage LLMs also as part of our technology, but it's not entirely based on those, because we all know that LLMs, for example, are non-deterministic. So we have developed techniques over the past years to actually control this non-deterministicity. So I think this is something that is opening up entirely new avenues for modern technology to be applied in highly regulated contexts as well, because this has previously been the challenge with FDA and other clinical use cases, that you can't really use measures that are black box. So our core IP is actually very organized methodology and technology that can be critically assessed, evaluated, and it can be also transparently applied in a clinical trial setting, so that the clinicians know where the insights come from, how are they calculated, and whether they are reliable or not. And we're doing this validation continuously.
Is this a field that a lot of companies are involved in?
I would say that this is an emerging field. So there is competition, and that's good news. So there are actually lots of companies, very interesting and promising companies in this area. What we've realized that lots of them are actually starting from the CNS space. So basically focusing on mental health, neurodegenerative diseases, for example, predicting early signals of Alzheimer's, or aiding in analyzing treatment response to Parkinson's, and purely cognitive and mental domains. What we see as a huge opportunity is broader. So we see that these behavioral models can be much broadly applied across any chronic diseases, and also more operationally in enhancing patient experience in trials by introducing new, more patient-friendly ways of collecting the data, as opposed to rigid, there are lots of questionnaires and surveys involved today. So there's an opportunity to streamline that experience. But the other thing, that these behavioral factors that were difficult to measure previously, it's now possible to measure these, and they will actually bring dramatic value to general clinical trials across disease areas. So, for example, if we think about one of the key challenges across, especially in chronic diseases, is the high dropout rates. One of the opportunities is that up to 38% of this non-adherence can actually be explained by personality and behavioral traits, such as consciousness, self-discipline, emotional stability. And these are things that we can measure today. And if we can leverage this information when we set up a trial, we will know which groups of patients will need more intense support throughout the trial, and we can better support them through these protocols.
Could you explain the term that's been bandied about, which is speech is the new blood?
Yeah, maybe I can go first. I love it. I just love this speech is the new blood, because it's so true. If you asked before, is this a crowded field? Is this being used a lot, this biomarker? It's been used. It's clearly been used, but it's almost like asking, is blood being used, right? I would say, for what purpose? Obviously, blood is being used, and obviously speech has been used in the mental health domain to listen to motor function and so on. You can easily sort of not easily, but you can pick up with custom models. You can pick up early diagnosis of someone maybe having a bit of issue with pronouncing words. But that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg, because we're talking about an extremely rich biomarker here. I think probably one of the richest ones, and at the same time non-invasive, easily collected. So it's very repeatable, very rich. When you then start to think about, with the new changes in technology, the new emerging, allowing us to process data on the go, it opens up this entire new field of not just looking at a custom model on someone's speech patterns, but looking at the entire personality and behavioral profile. And that, I think, is quite difficult. That, of course, requires years of understanding to be able to map this out, which is what the team has been doing for the last many years. So it's difficult, but I believe that we're going to see, just as blood, we're going to see speech behavioral biomarkers just become an absolute standard biomarker you apply in many different settings, just due to the richness and repeatability of it.
Even though I've done my career in information systems, my academic background roots to psychology and behavioral sciences, and I've always struggled with the gap between the sort of hard sciences and the soft sciences. There are very different traditions on how to measure empirical phenomena in these worlds, but I think these traditions are now starting to converge. And already 2020, I think there was an extensive review by Lowe and some other researchers that collected studies showing the vast amount of information and signals that speech as a data source carries. So we already have a significant body of research that we can build on to kind of apply the learnings that which characteristics of research tell objectively about a person's situation or state change. For example, changes in vocal energy, articulation rate, and pause structure can detect cognitive deterioration up to 7 to 14 days earlier than clinically. Clinician reported symptoms, and this was already shown in 2018. So I think now the matter is to kind of leverage this objective data as opposed to subjective reports and questionnaires. So it's a fundamental shift in what we actually measure. And speech is a rich data source that carries evident signals that are associated and correlate with a person's clinical state. And I think this is the sort of the essence of speech is the new blood. It is at least an equally, even if not a heavier, holy grail of human well-being that we're now opening up with the new technology. And I think regarding this new technology, the sort of the large language models and the speech technology, NLP and machine learning capabilities, I think we are now entering an entirely new era of how we can kind of converge these traditionally best perceived soft sciences with the harder sciences. And it's really exciting.
I'm interested in kind of exploring the technology a little bit, because as we're talking now, when you're doing the analysis of speech, is there any consideration given to the fact that if you're in an interview, you talk differently to the way that you would talk with friends? There are kind of different modes of speech. Is that taken into account?
Yes, it is, and it's highly contextual, of course. So in our earlier phase, we did do contextual labeling to speech intake, but in our current solution, if we think about the trial protocol, for example, we try to control the sort of the protocol in which speech is taken in to the extent that we can harmonize the intake data to some extent. But I think your question relates also to not only the context, but also cultural differences in people's backgrounds. So what our methodology enables is what we call cultural calibration. This is something that we need to be aware of. So instead of just taking raw speech data in, the fact that we have the middleware layer of behavioral patterns and behavioral models makes it possible for us to adjust and fine-tune those behavioral models for various cultural settings or contextual settings or disease area settings. And this is something that we need to do as part of the R&D work in clinical trials, that we need to calibrate the models per different indications and disease areas. But it's basically an architectural kind of tweak that we're doing. Regarding understanding the differences, how our technology actually works is that we do need to get baseline data. And just like, I don't know if you're using the Oura Ring or any of those solutions, but usually these heart rate based or well-being measures, for example, Oura Ring, you need to wear it for 2 weeks for it to learn your personal sleep patterns and baseline. Also, heart rate zones are highly unique and personal. So the idea also in heart rate monitoring is that the device learns your range, and then it sort of applies the guidance to your personalized range. And this is the same with speech. We have our own speech fingerprint. It's not only the voice, but it's the way we speak and intonate and pronounce things and use our vocabulary that the system needs to learn. We've studied that this takes up, if we take daily short snippets of speech, this takes about 2 weeks. And then we already have the personalized baseline calibration that we can use to detect significant state changes, for example, cross-treatment.
Ulrik had mentioned the clinical trials earlier. I wonder if you could go into a bit more detail on that as to how that specifically helps companies that are performing clinical trials.
Yeah, it makes sense to look at the use of these biomarkers in the, you can say, disease-specific domain and then the disease-agnostic domain. What you're asking to, so general study population health, is actually not really that closely related to a given disease. It could very well go across diseases. When the CRO and pharma and the PIs have to go out and start up the study, there's of course a lot of selection and stratification of your patient population, ensuring you have the right population to make a submission and relevant regulatory bodies. But you're also very acutely aware that you also need participants that have sort of some of the things you're looking to measure on, right? And it's well known that it can be quite difficult to figure out whether a person is suffering from that specific domain that you're actually going to design your study around. More than 60% of IBD patients, for instance, they report severe impact on sort of their sleep and work and social life, even when their sort of normal values show that their blood values show slow, moderate, or disease control. So there's clearly something here where you can say the traditional, more mechanistic biomarkers are, of course, very important, but needs to be supplemented. When we just remove all the disease-related stuff and just look straightly at the trials, then there's simple things that adheres to protocol. If you are running a study where there's some protocol maybe requiring you to have some certain sleep habits, exercise a bit, a diet, taking the medication together with a meal at certain times in the day, if you fail in many, especially of the chronic diseases, to adhere to that protocol, it will actually affect possibly your primary endpoint, so the efficacy of the drug, quite significantly. And that means that what you write on your label at the end of the day is not as close to the truth as it could be. If we're better at labeling different substances to different populations, it also becomes easier for physicians to figure out, well, you're a person maybe that has a strong adherence, you're doing a lot of exercise and so on, so this drug will work stronger for you. So just ensuring you have the right patient population. And then there's, of course, what Kassa talked about, this big dropout risk. It's quite significant, and a lot of it is less than you would think is due to side effects. A lot of it is due to practicalities, especially if you think you're on a placebo, traveling to the site to fill in questionnaires and do interviews and all of these things when you already maybe have a population where some of your most important subjects have a severe health condition or maybe fairly old. Then you would do whatever is required to make sure that you have a smoother study and as strong a population health as possible, both through the selection and the ongoing monitoring of that population by reducing all these practicalities as much as humanly possible.
I'd like to bring a couple of other points, since I mentioned earlier, and Ulrik also described IBD, the chronic diseases area. I think in the chronic diseases area, we have very interesting opportunities to really bring new concrete value to companies operating in this space. We're already initiating research with an organization focusing on, for example, the state change monitoring of chronic depression and schizophrenia. So this is purely in the CNS space, and obviously speech is interesting in that domain. But another interesting area where we're looking into is, for example, the cardiovascular, renal and metabolic disease area. And metabolic is especially interesting with the sort of the explosion of obesity as a market and a topic and the interest of clinical research. And obesity is very much also a behaviorally driven condition. And what's interesting about obesity trials or obesity medications is that if you do not do any lifestyle changes, the medications are also not going to pick up as intended. So it is actually imperative that when you get on the medication, you need to also change your lifestyle behaviors. And this is something that's very difficult to track and monitor. What makes it even more tricky is that the ability to carry out lifestyle change or like behavior change is very much connected to your self-efficacy and mental, emotional capabilities. And obesity is very often comorbid with multitude of mental challenges, anxiety, depression, fatigue is very highly comorbid with obesity. They're kind of interlinked because when, for example, sleep apnea is very common with highly obese patients, and sleep obviously impacts your ability to carry out behavior change and do lifestyle changes, which is key to these changes. And what we also know, what's interesting is that when you start a drug to treat obesity, the primary endpoint, which is weight, only changes after a month at earliest. So nothing happens on the scale for the first month when you start using medication. But if you change your behavior and your eating habits, we see changes in your speech already within 2 weeks. So this is interesting in the sense that clinicians could already at the early phases of starting a trial identify the groups of patients who have not even started the behavior change and intervene with enhanced support and understand where are the best odds of the medication also kicking in. So the kind of opening up these opportunities with speech technology to bring new data for disease understanding and for richer insights to optimize trials, I think that is really, really big, especially in the chronic diseases area.
A little earlier, you'd mentioned neurodegenerative diseases. How could this be applied to noticing changes in speech that can diagnose or help with diagnosis of diseases?
Speech technology and speech analytics is already being applied to support diagnosis. It's supported in studies on Alzheimer's or to detect mild cognitive impairment and depression. And I think there are fairly recent publications in 2020, 2024 on this, and there are companies also specializing in detecting early signals of Alzheimer's, for example, from speech or storytelling, retelling a story types of exercises that they record. So this technology is highly applicable in diagnostic context, but it is a big question still in the healthcare domain, where I spent the past 4 years before founding Adalyon, that who actually makes the diagnosis. And here I'm going to be cautious and emphasize that technology is there to help and to bring information for clinicians who are still essentially responsible for the final diagnosis of a condition, especially if it's associated with mental health. From technical and feasibility studies, we know in terms of numbers that the technology can do it, but it's more of an ethical question and also a pragmatic question that how do we want to keep the human in the loop?
And a very short add-on to that is the very related thing to diagnostics is early treatment detection. So is your treatment working? So that's sort of going the opposite way of diagnosis, that's seeing whether the symptoms are reducing. And that's a very obvious sort of connected area.
Because of all of those changes in technology and in the way that things are done, do you see speech and speech biomarkers becoming a part of everyday health monitoring, like wearables?
I wish it were. I wish my aura would listen to me every day and kind of warn me in the morning that, hey, today you better avoid some tricky conversations and whatnot. I do believe these devices are already listening in on us and targeting marketing based on that. I can think of far better and more valuable use cases in protecting and guarding our health. It is only a matter of time. And we've already been approached by a couple of hardware device area players. So we do know that it's cooking in their R&D. So I think that's another avenue that's going to be in front of us at some point. But now we're focusing on bringing value to the hardcore clinical space.
I think that's a very interesting, why haven't we seen this yet? And I think there's both a technology evolution with the introduction of large language models that allows us to handle data on the fly. Otherwise, this is a quite difficult, tedious task to sit down manually and annotate every conversation, and what you get is just a transcript. You don't get the richness of the conversation, the conceptual, all the speech and motor function. You just, the data hasn't been there. And then secondly, because I think it's just I think it's also it's a science that you need to operate in. And while we're seeing, I don't think we're seeing, but while I'm used to a certain level of conservatism in the pharmaceutical industry, then every time we do speak with partners around this, there is only interest. So I think as soon as sort of that potential is here, you don't have to explain it a lot to people working in this domain before they see, yeah, this makes sense. This is obviously an evolving domain that has a great potential. So I think, I honestly think that as the potential is becoming more and more clear to the industry, a lot of changes will be happening, and this will become a standard measure.
Some great content there, thought-provoking, and definitely an area with huge implications across a lot of conditions. Next, we're going to talk about hard-to-treat blood cancers with Nisit Khandelwal, co-founder and CEO of Cycuria Therapeutics.
So maybe then start, if you could just tell me a bit about the history of the company.
Yeah, so Cycuria Therapeutics was started like last year in June. So it's a pretty new company. It's 1.5 years old. And the whole concept came together when I met the scientific founder behind Cycuria, Professor Philip Joost. He's the director of the medical oncology unit at University of Graz. He had a fantastic mechanism for a new approach to treat AML that he was working on this manuscript that probably we'll speak about in a few minutes from now. And the idea was to see whether we can translate those scientific findings from the lab and the department into a drug development project. So I came in, I was introduced to them, to the founder by one of the investor contacts that I had, just to come in, sit in and give my 2 cents on whether it's a good drug development project, supposed to be an hour-long meeting. We ended up having a 5-hour discussion, strategizing how to best approach it, and what makes sense from a biotech point of view to work on that. And one thing led to the other, and we ended up co-founding Cycuria in summer last year. So since then, we have come a long way. We have translated those findings into an active molecule that we are working on actively now. At the moment, it's Cure 101. Based on the biology that was discovered in the labs of our scientific founder, Professor Philip Joost.
It was interesting when you mentioned that, because we hear about companies that start up like the one that you're talking about, and you have a discussion and you take those scientific findings and you manage to start a company. How unusual is that? I mean, are there lots of cases where there are scientific findings and you try, but it doesn't turn into something practical?
I guess it does, but you don't hear of them that much, right? So it's a positive selection of the ones that move forward that you get to know about. Luckily for me, I've been in 2 projects. I founded my first company, which also came out from my doctoral and postdoctoral work, and I worked on it for 9 years. So that translated out. But I guess there are some which don't make it to the light of the day. And it's a very hard field that we're working in, right? Oncology, drug development, the attrition rates are high. So I won't be surprised that there would be some of those examples out there. Luckily for us, so far so good, but you never know.
And you've been developing a treatment for acute myeloid leukemia. First, maybe could you give us a bit of background on the disease and why it's so hard to treat?
Absolutely. So acute myeloid leukemia is actually a form of blood cancer. It's one of the deadliest form of blood cancers that we know today. And it basically originates when your myeloid precursor cells that gives rise to differentiated blood cells in the body, they get stuck in an immature state in the bone marrow from where they originate. So usually these cells would differentiate, give rise to your blood cells, to your neutrophils, platelets. But somehow there's genetic epigenetic modification that happens in these precursor cells, and they get stuck in an immature state, and they start crowding up the bone marrow niche, making it difficult for healthy differentiated blood cells to populate the bone marrow or the circulation. Therefore, that gives rise to this very acute form of leukemia. The diagnosis and the progression of the disease is quite rapid, so you need urgent treatment options for these patients. And it's mostly common with elderly patients, so they do get, it's a disease of the elderly, so as people progress, they get this. There are also cases in young adults, but most of them are focusing on elderly patients where it's a very acute form of disease. You need to treat them quite urgently once you diagnose them. And that's something that makes us quite motivated to find a treatment for this kind of cancer, where there are not many options out there that effectively work in the clinic to an extent that you prolong the survival of patients to a very good extent.
Right. What are the current treatments?
Yeah, so surprisingly enough, still the standard of care in AML is actually intensive chemotherapy, which was approved ages ago. So it's a very intensive chemotherapy, including it's called the 7+3 regimen. For patients who can tolerate that kind of intensive chemotherapy, they're always frail and elderly patients whose immune system or the health status would not allow them to be tolerating this kind of intensive chemotherapy. So for those, you usually have venetoclax, which is a BCL2 apoptotic protein, anti-apoptotic protein inhibitor. And then there are very targeted therapies that have emerged in the recent years for certain mutational subtypes of AML. You have IDH1 inhibitors, FLT3 inhibitors, but they are active only in a subfraction of the entire disease, the fraction that carries those mutations for which then these therapies would be active for. So currently still the standard of care is intensive chemotherapy or the venetoclax azacitidine combination, which has its challenges.
Right. Is it an area that a lot of companies are trying to tackle?
It is definitely a crowded field where many innovation and many new therapies are actively seeking a solution for. So there are new emerging modes of treatment being tried out in preclinical or clinical studies, such as bispecific antibodies, CAR T-cell therapies. You have antibody drug conjugates also being explored in AML space. All comes with pros and cons, but it's an active area of interest for pharmaceutical and biotech companies to find a solution.
And what was your approach to trying to find a solution from that scientific research?
Right. I think I mentioned that current treatment options fail for 2 reasons. And one of them is either they are indiscriminate in their action towards the healthy hematopoietic stem cells, which you need to form your mature blood cell types. and towards the leukemic or the malignant fraction. So they act broadly on both of these precursor cells, and that's intensive chemotherapy. That's what it does. It stops the proliferation of all types of precursor cells, be it healthy or malignant. And that often leads to treatment or like dose-related side effects. So you can't have these patients treated at high doses of chemotherapy. So then they stop being effective after a certain point. Or there are newer therapies, the targeted therapies. They're very effective in eliminating the blast population, but you always have a leukemic stem cell fraction. This is the fraction that gives rise to all the malignant clones in the AML patient. So even though you can get rid of the malignant clones, if you don't get rid of the leukemic stem cell fraction that gives rise to the disease in the first place, you get good response with these targeted therapies and the initial rounds of treatment. But soon these patients relapse and they have a very aggressive form of the same disease after a few months of efficacy. And therefore, the intention for Cycuria was to find a treatment that is completely specific for both the stem cell fraction of leukemic population as well as the originating blast population, while sparing the healthy hematopoieses in order to uncouple efficacy from toxicity. And what the scientific team behind Cycuria has done amazingly over the last couple of years and have published this in this recent publication is understanding lymphotoxin alpha, a cytokine, a secreted cytokine in the human body that can actually specifically target leukemic stem cells and the blast population while promoting healthy hematopoiesis. So this is something that is unheard of, or at least not commonly seen in the clinical therapies out there, that you are promoting healthy and boosting healthy blood cell formation in these elderly patients while eradicating the causing fraction of the disease, the leukemic stem cells.
Could you tell me a little bit more about your lead candidate and how that works?
Would be pleasure to. So Cure 101 is actually a synthetic biologic based on a lymphotoxin alpha, and it binds to a receptor on the leukemic stem cells and blast population, and it does two things. A, it differentiates the leukemic stem cells to the mature cell types, which is exactly what the disease, as I mentioned in the beginning. AML is a disease of the immature cells being stuck in the differentiation pathway. So lymphotoxin alpha or our Cure 101 based therapy is actually able to make these cells differentiate into more mature cell types. Thereby, these cells lose the self-renewal property. Therefore, they are not malignant anymore over a certain rounds of replication. And the second thing it does is it induces directly a cell death pathway in those last cells. So it is able to induce a apoptotic cell death dependent on the TRAF2, TNFR1 signaling, and therefore eliminates these from the fraction. And while it does that, it actually doesn't have that same impact on the healthy hematopoietic stem cells. So Cure 101 is quite well tolerated in all our preclinical studies, and we see a great safety to efficacy profile for this molecule. So we believe we would have a very good therapeutic index in the clinic and will be able to bring forward a therapy that is not having cytopenia, neutropenia as a side effect profile, which most current available treatments for AML do suffer from.
And how is it administered?
So we are going forward with an intravenous administration. So it will be given to the vein. Over the period of time of the development, we are also exploring other modes of administration that makes it much more convenient for patient use. But our first approach would be to go with the intravenous, which is very compatible with the clinical applications that we see in today's treatment regimen.
And is it just a single treatment, or does it need to be repeated?
At the moment, we do believe it needs to be repeated for a certain course of cycles. We haven't yet explored the frequency and the dosing and the length of the treatment period yet, right? It's in the preclinical study. Those will all be a part of our clinical study design. But I believe after a certain phase, when we get the disease burden elevated in those patients, the treatment can be stopped and the patients would be monitored for their disease burden over a period of time. But unlike gene therapy, which is one-shot therapy, right, this would be a course of treatment, but very much within the lines of what current treatment options are, and slightly even better, maybe once or twice a month rather than a daily chemotherapy regimen.
Right. And do you think it would be a standalone, or would it be in combination with other treatments?
So I'm a big fan of monotherapy efficacy, right? This is what we need to show to tilt the balance and show that your efficacy comes from your agent, and that's sufficient. So far we have pursued monotherapy applications in all our preclinical models. But given that the safety profile of this approach is so conducive to combining it with more intensive regimens that I spoke about, which are standard of care today, 7+3 or Ven-Aza application, I think it will lend itself to be a great combination partner in first-line setting with already approved treatment. So those will be the two streams that will be following in parallel, focusing on monotherapy efficacy to be shown in the first instance, but soon translating that into a first-line combination approach.
Right. You mentioned earlier that it's a bit of a crowded field and lots of companies are working in this space. What are you doing that's different? And are there any other companies following a similar path?
So what makes Cycuria's approach unique are three things. A, monotherapy efficacy that we have shown in an aggressive disease setting. So we don't only prolong the survival in our preclinical mouse models, we basically don't get any tumor reemergence after 300 plus days of treatment. So in a mouse, it's practically a cure, but I'm very cautious of using that word in oncology, right? We have been curing mice for a long period of time. I would like to see that translate into the clinical studies. But the studies and the data that we have so far does bring forward that promise that the efficacy profile is quite superior in a mono agent application. The second thing that makes it unique is safety. We are boosting healthy hematopoiesis with our oncology treatment that is not a part of other therapies that I know of that are in development. So that's what makes Cure 101 stand apart from the crowd. And the third thing that I'm particularly excited about is it's a breadth of response that we have seen across different genetic mutational subtypes of AML. So AML is a very heterogeneous disease with multiple subgroups of genetic mutations on which they are classified. And most of the therapies that are being progressed today, targeted therapies, are focusing on one genetic subgroup of patients of AML. And what we have done in our preclinical studies have taken patients from diverse genetic backgrounds of AML and have shown that Cure 101 approach or LTA approach works broadly across diverse genetic subgroups of AML. So this could become a bit more commonly applied therapy in AML, regardless of the mutational profile of the patient. So those three things does make Cycuria's approach stand out from the crowd. But yes, the proof is in the pudding, and we'll show that in the clinic hopefully in a few years from now.
You mentioned the fact it's a new company, so where are you at on that clinical trial pathway?
We've just started on the trajectory, right? We started just a year and a half ago, translated that science into active drug candidates, which we have at the moment. And the next step for us is to produce this molecule at the GMP scale so that it's fit for clinical application in patients, complete all our non-clinical development work packages, including safety, toxicology, PK/PD, characterization. So I would say we are just 2 years shy of starting clinical trials in patients, and that's the most exciting phase to be in as a small biotech, bringing forward innovative solutions to patients.
And I know that you mentioned that word that maybe we shouldn't go there, the cure word. What's the goal ultimately? Is it to slow down the disease, or do you think that a cure is possible?
I think every drug developer should believe cure is possible. That's what keeps us motivated. So I do also hope that cure is possible. But there are many things that need to fall into place for this to be effective in the clinic as the way we think. So rational designing of clinical studies, being open-minded about combining it with different alternative and complementary treatments out there. I think those data sets will tell us really how much of an impact this can have in curing patients with blood cancer. But the current state, the 3-year survival rate in AML for patients is less than 20%. So if we can prolong that for a majority of patients, if we can double that time, and that already is a big step forward in this therapy's treatment outcome today, which hasn't changed much in the last 20 years. So I think even that step is going to be a monumental step. And hopefully we come together with other companies working on this, other pathways active on this to bring a combination approach that can ultimately lead to a cure. But it's a bit too soon to claim anything on that. So I'll reserve the judgment until we are in the clinic.
You mentioned quality of life, because obviously you don't want to extend somebody's life by 3 years if those 3 years are miserable.
Absolutely, and I think that's where therapies today are thinking of in the same breath. It's a very quantitative outcome that you want to achieve in your clinical trials. So the safety aspect, what attracted me to Cycuria and the science behind Cycuria was this unique safety aspect where you don't have dose-limiting toxicities that is commonly seen with intensive chemotherapy. So patients who come in for AML diagnosis, they get classified whether they are fit to handle intensive chemotherapy. But if they are not, the clinicians would switch them to alternative therapies, which may not be that effective. But if they can't tolerate the therapy, there is no point of having such a therapy, right? So I think the quality of life will also be an important factor. And we believe the safety profile that we are seeing, where people don't get cytopenia, neutropenia, as a result of our therapeutic approach, would make a difference in the clinic.
Would earlier diagnosis make any difference to the outcomes?
Absolutely. I think diagnosis always plays a key role in cancer treatment. How early can you catch the cancer? And I do believe with our approach, where the stem cell fraction gets differentiated into mature cells, if we can catch those stem cell fraction, leukemic stem cell fraction early on in the trajectory of the disease progression, and push them to differentiation, the better the control rate of the disease would be in the clinic and the better the outcome for the patients would be. But diagnosis is a complex topic. It depends on the region, on the diagnostic facilities, on the capabilities, on where you are as a patient, right? And what you experience before you get diagnosed. So I think diagnosis and therapeutics are evolving hand in hand over the next couple of years, but early diagnosis would certainly make a difference.
And you just had a paper published in Science Translational Medicine. What does that consist of?
That's a really cool publication that the group has been working on for I don't know how many years, but I'm glad that it's now out in the public domain. It really beautifully elaborates the whole molecular mechanism of how lymphotoxin alpha stimulates this therapeutic benefit in not only animal models, but more importantly in primary patient materials. So we used primary bone marrow biopsies from patients when they came in for initial diagnosis for their disease. And we cultured these cells with our therapeutic approach and showed the benefit also in the primary patient material. This is as close as you can get to showing therapeutic applicability in a clinical setting outside a patient. So leveraging these complex animal models as well as primary patient material, the group beautifully shows the signaling pathway that is triggered, the therapeutic benefit that is brought about, and they show how it is applicable in multiple genetic subgroups of AML. So, and very importantly, how it is so safe and efficacious at the same time. So we worked with a lot of primary material in the paper on also on the healthy cells and really dissected that the healthy cells are spared from the therapeutic approach, whereas it's the disease fraction that is specifically targeted by lymphotoxin alpha. There is a bunch of data in the paper, even more so in the supplementary, that really beautifully shows the molecular mechanism, which is a complex one, and I won't delve into that today with you, and probably I'm not the best person to also do so. You'll have to talk to the scientific founder, Philip, for that conversation. But it's an intricate pathway, a complex pathway, beautifully elucidated with really good supporting data that that's highlighted in the Science Translational Medicine journal article that we just published a couple of days back.
Right. And is that one of the reasons that you're going to Orlando for the meetings?
Yes. So we are having a poster presentation on the topic. We are sharing this new data on the molecule, on the lymphotoxin alpha biology at the American Society of Hematology. It's one of the largest conferences globally on the topics associated with hemato-oncology and hematology. And we are quite proud to be there with our data and the recent findings and share it with the broader audience in the scientific community and get feedback, questions, ideas, and further creative inputs as we bring forward the molecule.
Are you looking at this stage for partnerships, collaborations, financing?
All of the above. So as a small biotech company in today's financial time, we are exploring every avenue to collaborate to bring forward the molecule, right? Financing is a key piece to get us where we want to go. Clinical trials and non-clinical development is not cheap. So we are having discussions and interactions with big pharma players, venture funds around the conference as well, to get them to appreciate what lymphotoxin alpha can do for patients in the clinic and to take those discussions forward.
Is there anything else in the pipeline, or are you just focused on this?
So we are laser focused on this at the moment, right? We know our challenges and our limitations as a small biotech company. So I think our focus is to really bring forward Cure 101 all the way into the patients and AML setting. While having said that, we are also exploring its broader applicability in other tumor entities, which would expand the profile of where this therapy could be applied.
Well, some more excellent science and some real hope there for better treatment of blood cancers such as AML. And so for our third interview, it's another with two guests. Scottish Brain Services recently set up a new facility in Aberdeen at ONE BioHub. So we combined the two to talk about Scottish Brain Services and the ONE BioHub. The conversation also included life sciences in Scotland and a few other things as well. And the conversation is with Craig Ritchie, founder and CEO of Scottish Brain Sciences, and with Deborah O'Neill, CEO and CSO of NovaBiotics. And she is also chair of the Life Sciences Board of Opportunity Northeast, which runs the ONE BioHub. She's also chair of BioAberdeen as well. So, a very wide-ranging interview for you.
Maybe then to start, I wonder if you could give me a bit of background on SBS and the work that you're doing.
We set up Scottish Brain Sciences in June 22, but then the company started really trading in January 23, so we're almost 3 years old now. And the reason for setting up Scottish Brain Sciences was that I come from a background as a clinical academic, having worked in the NHS and university sector for getting on for 25, 30 years, and was recognizing in my sort of scientific world, there were so many things that we were learning and able to do for people with Alzheimer's disease and people at risk of Alzheimer's disease. But in my clinical world, I found quite a big disconnect between what we knew scientifically we could do and even should be doing and what we were actually able to deliver to our patients. So I set up Scottish Brain Sciences really to bridge that gap between scientific knowledge and clinical application. I like to refer to the company as a translational medicine organization. And translational medicine is typically thought of as this bench to bedside, translating discoveries into clinical tests or treatments. And what we're trying to do with SBS is shorten the gap between discovery and delivery. It usually takes about 10 years, and we think it should be almost instantaneous. So that's why we set up SBS. And to be fair, we've probably been reasonably successful in that 3 years in achieving that objective.
As an aside, what you were mentioning there about that disconnect, do you think that that's obviously from your perspective that exists, but do you think it's a wider problem than that it's in many different fields?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think this translational gap, as we call it, is true of science generally. And I think that's understandable. There's always going to be a delay in getting scientific breakthroughs embedded into routine clinical practice. But I think for me, I was actually seeing that gap getting wider in terms of dementia care or in terms of dementia prevention or brain health. So I think in other specialities, oncology, HIV medicine, etc., there's probably a much more rapid translation of findings into practice. And I think the field of Alzheimer's, the clinical practice, has stayed pretty static for 20 or 30 years. So the gap between discovery and delivery is, to my mind, was actually widening rather than narrowing.
This is your third facility. Could you explain kind of why you have three and where they are and the reasoning for that?
Yeah, so we started off in Edinburgh. I was living and working in Edinburgh at the time. So our first facility was in Edinburgh. And then the next development was we built a laboratory in the incubator space at St Andrews University in Guardbridge. And then very soon after that, we opened the facility here in Aberdeen. The reason for that is most of the work we do, in fact, all of the work we do is patient facing. So we wanted to make sure that we were covering as far as possible the Scottish population. We've got plans to open up in the West Coast, maybe around Paisley and Glasgow, and find a way to access the Highlands and Islands, people to have access to our studies over there. So I think the reason for Aberdeen and Edinburgh was to make it convenient for participants to come and visit and take part in the research that we run. The laboratory in St Andrews is because what we were trying to do is we use the strap line, we don't want to leave anything to chance. And the more that we can do of the research in-house, the quicker we can do it. If you have to rely on third parties for delivering research, you often find they become the rate limiting step. So by having our own laboratory, and we've got plans to have our own imaging facilities in due course, we then can progress our research much more quickly, much more effectively, and that's very attractive to our partners in industry.
And what's that going to mean for Alzheimer's patients? And conversely, what's it going to mean for research?
Yeah, so I think for Alzheimer's patients, I mean, it's unfortunately the case that if a GP referred a person into a memory clinic in the UK, generally the waiting time for an assessment is anywhere between 6 months and 2 years. So with our approach, which is, yes, we get GP referrals, but we mainly work direct to the public. So people who may be on a waiting list or they've been recently discharged from hospital or from a clinic, we can see them within days. So what we've been able to do is really embrace the aspirations, the hope, the requirements of that clinical community. And the cohort study we run, our flagship cohort study called Iona, was almost 700 people in it already after just a few months of running it. So I think we're really engaged for want of a better word, our customer, which is the person in the community who's concerned about their brain health or has actually received a diagnosis and has symptoms. So for the people with Alzheimer's, we're offering a really good service and access to clinical trials, which I think is obviously critically important.
What about choosing ONE BioHub? How was that process?
I'd like to say it was a no-brainer. I mean, it's just an incredible facility. When we were looking around Aberdeen to begin with, I mean, I was looking at where we originally were in Edinburgh was in South Gyle, which was, well, I know it's an international audience, but it was in a kind of like a light industrial state at the outskirts of Edinburgh near the airport. And that was just because from a cost perspective, that's what we could afford. We had to refit the building slightly to make it purposeful. And when we came to Aberdeen, we kind of learned from that experience and thought, much better that we go to a centre like this, which has all the facilities, the proximity to the hospital, proximity to the university. And we started here with a couple of rooms on the first floor just to get our sort of foot in the door while we built out this kind of state-of-the-art facility we now have in the building. I've been working in clinical research all over the world, in Australia, UK, England, and this is in Scotland. And I've probably opened up a dozen clinical research facilities myself, and this is far and away the best because it's been built from the ground up for our needs. And it's staggering. I think that, but more importantly, the patients think that too. That's hugely important, not just for engaging the public in what we do, but making sure they want to come back and have further visits. So I think it's just been an absolutely perfect location for what we're trying to do. And there's also proximity to people like Deborah because we do lab work here as well. So having, other companies in the building alongside us is inspirational. We share pain points, we share various, challenges, but we can also share resources if we need to, which is, again, hugely beneficial to startup companies.
Okay, so maybe then, Deborah, could you take over and give me a bit of the history of ONE BioHub?
Absolutely. So the idea for BioHub was really distilled 9 years ago. So Opportunity Northeast is 10 years old, so big anniversary year this year. The life science component of that really got going 9 years ago. And what was clear from the outset was the infrastructure to do everything that Craig's talked about, everything he's mentioned in terms of companies, even just focused on the lab end of research. The infrastructure just wasn't there. So we had all of these fantastic spin-out companies who were coming out of the university really with nowhere to go. Once they moved into the commercial phase, no fit-for-purpose bespoke space. So they had to incubate in university facilities, for much longer than they really should have. My own business has been on a farm. So we found some lab space at one of the rural colleges, SRUC as it now is, because that, was the only space we could physically move into. And then in the middle of an industrial estate. So yeah, I mean, it's been needed for a long, long time. And that was clear. So when ONE started, the life science stream got going, this was a priority transformational project to construct that space and have that on the most appropriate location, co-located with the hospital and one of our two great universities in Aberdeen. So that's why BioHub is on the Forester Hill Health Campus, very much in the middle of that triple helix environment. Construction began just before the pandemic and continued through COVID, which was incredible. We didn't really have any delays to the construction project. The building went live in 2023, so it's still very, very new. We opened for some events and then had our first tenants in from sort of the end of 2023. Scottish Brain Science moved in 24, and NovaBiotics and NovaBiotics Consumer Health, my businesses, just after that. So it definitely serves a need that's been there for a while in Aberdeen and the Northeast, and Opportunity Northeast was really the catalyst, and also bringing in the City Region deal funding. So this is a public-private partnership, and one of the transformational projects that came from that place-based investment by both the UK and the Scottish Government. And it's a fantastic facility that's now delivering everything we said and we hoped it would do 9-10 years ago.
Craig was mentioning St Andrews and Edinburgh. Obviously, there's a big hub in Edinburgh, but what are the kind of centres for biotech and the life sciences in Scotland?
So Scotland, and this is coming out actually in the Scottish life science strategy, which, you know, the ink's almost still wet on that. It's very, very new. It was only launched a few weeks ago. Scotland itself is a cluster, a super cluster, if you like, and there are different strengths and areas of expertise across the different subclusters if you look at the different geographies. So Aberdeen has always had strength in biologics, drug discovery, in imaging, in microbiology, so certain specialties that are linked with the world-class academic research that's been happening in Aberdeen since 1495, by the way. So we are very good at taking therapeutics discovery and development further on. It's not just early stage stuff. We're focused on commercializing what we're doing, but the strength in Aberdeen and the Northeast is the development of therapeutics, also diagnostics and devices, the later stage translational work that SBS are doing, the fact that, you know, we have companies who are now waiting for regulatory approvals. So that element of the commercialization, the late stage development is very strong. Just down the road, Dundee, similarly, very, very strong in drug discovery. The Dundee Drug Discovery Unit has a phenomenal track record of getting medicines, particularly for infectious disease, through later stage clinical trials in partnership with pharma companies and onto the market. So slightly different, I would say, more of a chemistry-led rather than biology-led expertise, but complementary to what we're doing. So part of a Northeast drug discovery and development cluster, if you like. You mentioned Edinburgh, absolutely. So Dundee has its own very new innovation centre, very different from BioHub, again, in terms of the infrastructure's focused on chemistry-led drug discovery. BioQuarter is different, but complementary to what we have in the Northeast. So we have the Edinburgh cluster. Glasgow has just had a big chunk of government funding to drive its innovation in life science. So every geography is slightly different and complementary. So we have these subclusters and slightly different ecosystems that make up the wider Scottish supercluster, if you like. I think the one thing that sticks out that's unique about what we're doing in Aberdeen through One Life Science, with BioHub as the physical centre of that, is beyond the science and the support for founders, the entrepreneurial training, the business support. So that whole wraparound support, advice, so these products that we're developing, which are transformational with the potential to impact health globally, do become products. So the founders and the companies are supported as well as the science. So that's unique about the Aberdeen ecosystem. We're very focused on the commercialization and the end result of that innovation.
I was at the Spacecom event in Glasgow last week, and that seems to be another growing sector. Are there any synergies there potentially with the life sciences industries?
I have one interesting anecdote, and this was before I think space in Scotland was as much of a priority as it is, in that one of our Aberdeen businesses, an Aberdeen that was sold quite a few years ago, but an antibody-based company, were actually teed up to have one of their therapy candidates sent into space. True story. And I believe that was something to do with assessing stability. And in the future, we're going to need therapies that have to be stable and functional in very, very different environmental conditions, including zero gravity. I don't think that ever happened, but it was all set to. So that was quite exciting. So there you go, not just a link between biotech and space, but an Aberdeen spin out that then went on to do amazing things. In fact, one of our other companies, Elasmogen, is a new iteration of Haptogen, the company that was nearly sending antibodies into space. So let's see what happens in the future. As you say, two exciting, rapidly moving sectors. So who's to say what we might do with the space sector in the future?
When I heard you that question, Jim, I was scratching to think about how Scottish Brain Sciences could get into space. But maybe that's a centre for the future. We could open up in a satellite somewhere, excuse the pun. The thing that I think about, though, about that innovation is how, let's look at Scotland as a whole and think about where traditionally we've had our industries. If you turn back the clock, 50, 100 years, it was heavy industry, it was shipbuilding, it was mining, it was steelworks, etc. But we've always been blessed with very high per capita university base. And I think what we're looking towards the future is, much more technically based and scientifically based industries. And I think life sciences, space fit that bill perfectly. So I'm not sure there's maybe direct crossover with products, but I think creating an ecosystem in Scotland whereby we're recognised for technical developments and scientific developments, as we have been with television, penicillin, telephone historically, I think we need to regain that momentum. And I think whether it's life sciences or space, 2 + 2 = 5. So I think that's the way I think about all the wonderful stuff going on in that kind of sector in Scotland. The connections that Scotland has and the reputation Scotland has globally facilitates exporting our businesses to other parts of the world. We're often seen as a good partner. The way that Scotland is perceived by other countries, by other communities, is usually uniquely positive. So I think that does help, and we should leverage that in terms of how we take our businesses overseas. Obviously, huge connections with Scandinavia through the oil business, and we need to build on the reputation we have from that into expanding from a Scottish base to the rest of the world.
Just to add to that, I think that's the model, Jim. I think all innovation in any sector in Scotland, but absolutely life science, we're very outward looking as well. So, we're operating in the global market. So there are many, many reasons for remaining headquartered in Scotland and Aberdeen in particular, but absolutely those connections internationally that are welcomed internationally is something that we're also very good at generating. Yeah, we have great support through Scottish Development International, which is part of our national enterprise agency, Scottish Enterprise. So, yeah.
What would your pitch be for either Aberdeen or for Scotland as a place for American companies to bring offices over here?
It's not just the infrastructure and the ability to do the science, it's all the wraparound support that I mentioned. So you're in fantastic bespoke space with access to the best networks, entrepreneurial support, founder support. It truly is a unique ecosystem. We've got a fantastic airport. You're in London within an hour, so we're very connected. Geography isn't really an issue. We're even closer to Oslo. We're a very international city.
Just to build on that, I think, we don't have to turn the clock back. I mean, I'm originally from Aberdeen and I grew up in the 80s, and, the whole world came to Aberdeen because of the oil industry, and I remember globally, or the European headquarters, at least for most of the oil companies were actually within the city. So we've got a tradition, a history of being an international hub for a sector. One of the other things I think is critically important about Aberdeen and Scotland generally is the proximity between decision makers. Despite being from Aberdeen, I actually still live in London. And I worked at a UCL, I worked at Imperial, I was quite a senior sort of administrator, if you like, within the NHS and R&D departments, etc. It's very hard to get things done because there were so many layers between your idea and the delivery of that idea. And I think what you find in Scotland is a much clearer pathway for having ideas. And I think, some of the things that Deborah and I have talked about require government support. Our unit here opened a few weeks ago by Richard Lochhead, which was amazing to have, the business and employment minister opening up the centre. Even in England or in London, I think it had been really hard for a centre of this nature to get opened up by a minister of state. So I think these things actually matter. And the other thing I think is a blindingly obvious thing. You ask, why would people want to relocate here? I mean, Lonely Planet always rates Scotland as the most beautiful country in the world. And I think the quality of life here is second to none. And having lived and worked in the Golden Triangle for most of my life, you get a lot more for your penny up here than you do down in the southeast of England. So I think, there are lots of reasons why businesses should locate here and people should locate here as well to really enjoy a good work-life balance, which is critically important.
We've got a lot of interest from companies and groups elsewhere in the UK who are very interested in what we have in Aberdeen, international companies as well, plus our homegrown pipeline of really exciting life science businesses that BioHub is the destination for them.
Some great information on the company and the life sciences scene in Scotland, and more specifically in Aberdeen. A great city, and the scenery in the county there is just amazing, having been there not that long ago. It's kind of on the opposite side of Scotland to where I live, but not that far. Funny how when I lived in the US and Canada, you'd think nothing of a 5-hour drive to go somewhere. And yet in the UK, you look at a 4-hour drive to Aberdeen and it feels like the equivalent of going away for the weekend. So that's it for this week's podcast and for my voice. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities, or you want to advertise, or for anything else, please do contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. So, until next time, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast.
The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.